Hello, this is Matthew here from Nations of Sanity. Just doing a quick video on rights. Just want to give a definition of rights and explain the logic behind deciding what rights we actually should have. Now, just to define rights quickly, rights are basically entitlements. If you say you have a legal right to something, then you're basically saying that you have a legal entitlement to it. And if you say you have a moral right to something, then you're basically saying you have a moral entitlement to it. So probably the best and most concise definition of rights would be to call them entitlements. Now, the implication to being entitled to something or having a right to it is that other people are obliged to provide that right for you in some way. This is why there's such an important distinction between what some people call negative rights and positive rights. Now, the Nations of Sanity project that I represent only deals in negative rights. We deal in the right of self-ownership, which is the right that people have over themselves. The idea that everybody has right over only their own self and not over anybody else. Now, if you have that right, then the only obligations that fall on other people is to leave you alone. There's no positive obligation. There's no positive rights that you're demanding. You're not saying, oh, I'm entitled to this, that, or the other. You're saying that you're entitled to yourself. You're entitled to have ownership and right over your own self, over your own actions, over your own consciousness, your thoughts, your words you speak and write down, and all the rest of it. So basically that's what self-ownership is about. It's about saying that you're responsible for yourself because you have right over yourself. You own your actions in the sense of being responsible for them, but also in the sense of that they're your actions. You have the right to make those actions. It's your body. You have the right to do what you will. And the only condition to that right is that you don't violate anybody else's right to the exact same freedom, that exact same self-ownership. So this is why, this is what rights are. It's important to understand what right is, because the problem with positive rights is that they violate negative rights. So for example, if I say that I have a right to a house, or I have right to healthcare or welfare or any of these things, what the implication of that is that other people are obliged to provide me with these things. If I have a right to a house, then other people are obliged to provide me with a house because it's my right. I'm entitled to it. If I have a right to healthcare, again, someone else is obliged to provide me with healthcare. Now, with regards to negative rights, the right that comes from my basic right of self-ownership, like as I say, the only obligation that falls on other people is to leave me alone. So my right to not be punched in the face just means that other people aren't allowed to punch me in the face. Like I say, my right to my body means that I decide what does and doesn't happen to it. I can be punched in the face if I want to be. There are people that may have some kind of kinky desire to be hit. And as self-owning individuals, if that's what they want, then they can give permission for that. But the permission has to come from them. I can't give permission for you to punch somebody else in their face, but I can give you permission to punch me in my face if I wanted my face punched. So, this is an important thing to understand. It's important to understand what rights are, because when people say, oh, well, healthcare is a right, or welfare is a right, or we have a right to a home and stuff like that, they need to step back and think about what they're actually saying. Because when you say you have a right, you're saying you're entitled to it. And that means that other people are obliged to provide it. Now, the reason I say that we don't have a right to healthcare, we don't have a right to homes, or anything else that requires the effort and labour of other people, is because to enforce that right, you would have to violate the self-ownership of other people by forcing them to provide things. So this is important to understand. It's important to understand what a right is. Now, another thing that's important to understand is just because I don't think it's a right that people have healthcare, and I don't think it's a right for people to be provided with homes and stuff like this, that doesn't mean I don't think we should have these things. I very much support that we provide healthcare to anybody that can't provide it for themselves. I very much support the idea that we provide homes to people that can't provide for themselves. In fact, in general, I think we should provide for people who can't provide for themselves. I think that is what a civilized and moral society would do, but they would do it off their own volition. They would do it voluntarily, not under coercion, not under the threat of force, not because it's anybody's right to have these things, but just because we can all recognize that we would have a better society if we provided these things. And a society where people are starving, a society where people are homeless, don't have good health care, don't have the ability to have a home even, and things like this. This is a society that's not a good society to live in, even for the people that aren't suffering those indignities. Things like crime, for example, increase when poverty increases. So it's not unreasonable to say that for our benefit as a society, it would be a good idea, as well as the morally right thing to do, to make sure that there aren't people suffering and starving without homes, without access to basic healthcare and these things. So I just think people need to divorce that. We need to understand what rights are. We need to understand that the only right that we can all have in equal measure is the right over ourselves, over our own self, the right of self-ownership. That's the only right we really have. The only right I have is over myself. I don't have right over anybody else, and I don't have right to anything else. I have right over myself, and that is the one right that everybody can have in equal measure. Any other rights, then things become unequal, and then you end up having to violate one right to provide another, and it just becomes a corrupt and contradicting mess. So this is why it's important. I hope I've been clear in this video to define what rights are. Rights are entitlements, and why the only valid right, the only right that can be applied universally and equal to all, is the right of self-ownership.